Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. A number of years ago, I had an experience with my guides that I think most of us who've done shamanic journey have had at some point if we do it regularly, which is to say we go to talk to our guides about a very particular thing that's on our mind. There's some question we want to ask or some place we want to get more clarity or peace or healing. And the guides say, yeah, we actually want to talk to you about this other thing. And I think of that as guide override. It doesn't happen all the time, but there are these moments when the guides really have something on their mind that they feel is really important to share that isn't trickling down through all the other ways that we get information psychically, because there are quite a number of pathways that happens, even if we're not super consciously aware of it. But in this particular case, they said, no, we want to talk to you about something else. And the something else was a destiny path choice point that had arisen for me. There was a couple of different options for how the future could unfold. And one of them was a lot more vibrant and alive and had a lot larger impact on the world. And the feedback that they gave me and the thing they said to me was, the thing is, you're using a lot of your magic to stabilize things, not because an alternative would be bad, but because you really don't like change. You really don't like things to shift and change. And so you're using your magic to infuse stability into situations that really aren't aligned. They don't serve you anymore. You're still staying with them. And I could really find that. I could find the way that my engineering job wasn't as aligned and that it was past time to really step fully into doing shamanic work as my full-time gig. And yet I was fighting to hang on to this thing that I wasn't really showing up for. I was really fighting myself even on a very limited number of hours a week because I was so much more called to the business, and I'd built it as far as I could as a side hustle. It really needed my undivided attention to have that forward movement. And another place I really do that is trying to stabilize living environments. So I stayed with the boyfriend that I had in my 20s because we owned a house together and I really loved the house, and he and I weren't abusive, but we weren't being particularly successful either. And we kind of tried the version of living together where we had a really big house and separate rooms, and maybe we could just be, roommates and not have to give up this house. And then I bought a condo after that, and I stayed living there long after it was clear to me that I just wasn't enjoying being in the urban density that was the situation with the condo that I could afford in the San Diego area. And likewise, when my engineering job stepped away, I wasn't bound to a commute that meant that I had to live as far toward the ocean as the condo was located. Not that it was on the ocean by any measure, but I needed that accessibility to physically get to my job, and then I didn't. And then I moved into a place where I spent a decade with a gal. And at the beginning of living in this, cute little granny flat in La Mesa, it was really lovely. But several years in, my landlord got involved with a man who was really unregulated on some really heavy drugs, ultimately meth, cocaine, a whole mix of things, and also domestically violent with her. And it was a really intense situation. I never felt unsafe. He never, ever, ever messed with me. He was always interested in staying on my good side, and I was never afraid for my safety. But I did spend time sitting there with my phone in my hand, wondering if the argument was bad enough that I should be calling 911, and ambivalent about what I did because I didn't want to lose my home. And she would, say she'd get a restraining order and then not enforce it or not do it. And, it was just a really tough situation. And I told myself the story that I couldn't easily afford somewhere else in San Diego because, first of all, there was truth to that. She had not raised my rent. I was paying ridiculously little for the market by the time it reached the point of no return for what just became really unbearable about the situation. Because as with many of these kind of situations, it was in a downward spiral. The more drug use over time was really breaking down his body, and he was, really less and less emotionally regulated, if you could ever have applied such a comment to the fellow in question. And so I ended up having to move very urgently because of the situation getting past what I was prepared to tolerate. But I tolerated a lot, and the move would have been a lot more graceful. So these are some examples I have, the living space of just really stabilizing it. When I was living at the place with the meth addict, I put up, the most epically effective wards, and I moved in a bunch of rose quartz and obsidian to surround my house with. And it worked after a fashion. I don't want to say that the time was miserable. But when the guide said this thing about me using my magic to create stability, I could really find that in myself. I could really find the parts of me that were scared of change, that liked things the same, even if it wasn't the most elegant. It had completed its duration. By the time I left the fellow I was with in my 20s, with whom I owned the house, I was just mad at him all the time, because there was so much that wasn't okay with me about the relationship, that he swore up one side and down the other that he'd change, but that wasn't what he was available for. And my path forward was to not talk to him again for the most part, not because I was mad and not because I was bitter. I have a lot of compassion for how miserable 20-something Katie trying to control things was to live with. And there was a reason I did a lot of therapy to not, torment people. But we had some of the classic codependency stuff, and he had some addiction issues. And my not talking to him was just the profound relief of never having any of my outcomes tied to trying to be heard by this man, because there was some part of me that just so believed if I could find the words to be heard and understood, and he would nod his head vigorously and agree with me and then go back and do the same thing all over again. And so these times where I fought change, I could see it on a really physical level and a choice level, but I could also see it on an energetic level. And what I've found about each of these situations that I describe, I think of it energetically like pulling a rubber band when the energy naturally wants to cycle and move and flow. Maybe we've done some really good inner work and we're no longer compatible with a partner or a family situation or a friendship, and yet we really, really, really don't want to let it go. And then the ending ends up being dramatic and, somewhat chaotic, and there can be a lot of hurt feelings and, a lot of events. And when we're kind of not coughing up the truth in a relationship or not being resourceful about moving. When I was living on the property with the meth addict, I would have an event, the police would come onto the property really dramatically and carry him off and, whatever would happen. And then I would do one online search and verify that apartments were costing more than this sweet little place I had with beautiful views and a hot tub and a private courtyard. And, it was a sweet setup. The place was small, but really aligned. But I would do one search. And in retrospect, my movement out of that situation would have been so much more graceful if I'd just been really persistent at looking for an alternative as an ongoing project of a problem that I would need to solve. And I have no doubt I could have found something really aligned if I'd continued to put out the word and ask friends and look around and, just go look at places. But that isn't what I did. I basically did research to validate the choice that I really wanted to make, which was to give myself an excuse to try to make it work. I also had a lot of money concerns, but when I moved into what was, in fact, a considerably more expensive place because the market had gone up, I figured out how to be more resourceful in my business and create win-wins in a different way. So I didn't massively raise my rates, but I did find more elegant ways to be in energy exchanges with people that meant that I wasn't so cost sensitive in terms of my living situation. The relief of not living in a bad situation resulted in me being more resourceful, which resulted in more income, which meant I could pay market value for the place that I really wanted. And I have ended up in a place that I absolutely love living. It's the best Katie habitat ever. So you might not be someone who finds this pattern of using a lot of your energy and will and personal choice to stay in something that isn't the right thing related to a home environment. It might be a job where you're burned out and really over it and not receiving the promotions or the acknowledgement or the pay and becoming increasingly disengaged and resentful, but scared to really take that step and look for something else. Or it might be a relationship where you're deeply unhappy. I've certainly had those where I bent the ear of everyone close to me with my angst about whoever I was with, but, didn't up and leave them. There were some times when I was really tedious, where I was really triggered and emotional and full with what wasn't working for me in relationships, but not willing to actually make the move of leaving them. And I really credit the generosity of some of the people who loved me, who could probably never hear the name of the particular person or people again and be very happy with it, because they hurt a lot over the years. And it may be, not one of these categories. It might not be home or work or relationship, but somewhere else where you can find that you've gotten into something that really is a no to some part of you, that absolutely, positively doesn't work for a big part of you, and yet you're avoiding, for some people, maybe it's a little more wine. For some people, it could be online shopping. Maybe you're, getting more into Facebook. You're getting these kind of short-term chemistry hits, or, getting involved in something else. There are all these ways that we kind of work with this. But I think it's a fairly universal human thing to strive to keep things the same that feel like there'd be a lot of ego death. And I have a lot of compassion for us. For our ancestors, they tended not to move home a lot. You see feudal people were very bound to the land. You see hunter-gatherer tribes, their territory was really what they were in with. And it was a big deal. When in the US we look at I may say it wrong, we don't actually know how it's pronounced, but the Anasazi people, as we've termed them, who just suddenly up and left. And we know they left because of what they took with them, but there's speculation like, oh, maybe there was a lot of years of drought or some kind of an experience that had people having to pack up land that they've lived on for generations and generations. And this was long before the conquistadora and all of the Europeans coming to the New World. It was, previous to this when this experience happened. And so we have a lot of reasons that our instincts defend stability. If you're in a female body and you're involved with a man and the relationship isn't going so well, our instincts will tell us that unless we have somebody else stepping in as a provider, protector, we're better off staying with him, even if we make more money than he does. There's just so much about the history of, hunter-gatherer tribes where that was really important to have a provider, protector. Men and women teamed very effectively. And even in modern era, it's not super recent that women had the right to vote or own property. And in a lot of places in the world, they still don't. So there are these kind of deep primal moves that make us afraid to make changes. And the thing about our instincts is that our instincts vote against change unless we know we're going to die. And so there's a lot of adversity to making a change that is in service to happiness and fulfillment, because the more unhappy we are, the more our instincts are activated. And the more our instincts are activated, the more they're trying to just survive. And if you look at Maslow's pyramid of needs, self-actualization, meaningful connection, these are all really important. But when survival fears are activated, there's a part of us that primally is fighting against us making a move because it's more elegant. And our instincts don't know about the benevolence of the modern era where we can choose and choose again and try to start a business, and half businesses fail, but those people are unlikely to end up homeless. For sure, some of them do, but there's a lot of possibility and resilience and choice and the ability to choose again, especially if we're willing to be resourceful and resilient and kind of in the game. There's an astounding amount of ability to have a path forward to be okay. But our instincts don't realize that, so they throw up a feeling of survival fear about making a change. And in retrospect, I can see really clearly when I kept figuring out a way to hunker down and make it work living on a property with a meth addict that I was really doing that. And so I think it's useful not to kind of make this other. I find it interesting. We have a lot of conversations about addiction, and that seems to be sometimes put onto these other people who have a drinking or drug problem that looks a really particular way. And yet, I think most of us, I know a few people who, just don't really have addictive personalities at all. And I'm kind of in awe of them. They don't have to worry about feeling stress and eating too much sugar or being on Facebook or binging, too much on Netflix beyond what they need to, have some mental downtime. But within most of us, if we really own that, we can find the behavior that we have that provides some form of relief or pleasure that isn't really on the side of our sustainability. Repeatedly skipping moderate exercise, or again, sugar is a one that I provide myself with a lot of adult supervision around to keep it in certain bounds where it doesn't swing out. But it's useful to find that. And so I would invite you, perhaps in 2020 hindsight, to find those moments where you started using your resourcefulness to figure out a way to stabilize a situation that really wasn't good for you. And a lot of times once we get free of it, we leave the relationship, we leave the job, we have something better. We're like, oh man, why did I stay too long? It's such a great thing to be on the other side of it, but we can't always see that. And so one of the things, this came up in a journey, I was doing a group journey for people, and one of the distinctions that I was asking for on their behalf with their guides was to help these take-apart times to go with grace and really propel us to the next thing. And so what I mean by take-apart is when a structure or an organized way that we're running our energy changes. So losing a job is a take apart. An ego death of a pattern is a take apart as well. So if you go into therapy, there'll be a lot of experience of take apart and a lot of tension when you break family cultural rules for something that is healthier and saner and more aligned for you. There's a lot of ways that this take apart comes up. And one of the great things about having friends who, know the vocabulary and know the experience of being on a personal growth path is that I can call up my best friend and say, oh, I'm having such a take apart day. And she'll know that means that I'm pretty uncomfortable and things are sorting themselves out, but it's all to the greater good. There's nothing broken or wrong or that needs solving. It's just a part of the cycle that is darned uncomfortable, very activating to the instincts. And for some of us, we just pull the rubber band a little bit. That's kind of how I think about this resisting change that is what wants to flow, that's appropriate, that there are parts of us saying this isn't working for us. And if we pull that rubber band too hard, as undoubtedly if you overstress a rubber band, it can break and the parts can fly lots of places. It can snap on your finger and have a sting. It can fly across the room. There's this experience where energy is being built up in this tension that's being created by us using our will and our choice and our energy to stabilize something that naturally wants to move forward into the next iteration of what it is. It's a side note, but I remember hearing from people, especially coming up on 2012, that all the economic systems are going to completely change. We won't even be using money anymore. And I could see that we were in a time of immense change and the energy's moving, but money is pretty much just an agreement of a story that we're all participating with. And it does have reality and consequence. I'm not suggesting we can say, oh, it's just a story, I can ignore it. But the stability that's created by so many people still being invested in the old way, even if it's not the most elegant, provides a certain amount of stability. So it's just an interesting thing to note when you're like, oh, the energy's over here and the old system is over here. And there's a lot of tension between that. We see that in the ways we're reckoning with racial injustice, because the general heart and soul of most of the people who are, incarnate in the developed nations is that we want fairness, we want equality, we want everyone to be well. Some people are, not so much. And, you can have a correlation between certain political views and the size of the part of the brain that governs the instincts. So people who aren't as invested in this tend to have instincts that rev higher. It's just a useful thing to know. But in general, there's this tension between this very authentic desire and the legacy of a lot of systems that were constructed in very particular ways to confer power in the hands of the few. And we don't have to go back that far in history to see this whole industrial revolution and the birth of democracy in the modern iteration, in the American Revolution and the French Revolution, where people are like, yeah, we're done with feudalism. We're not cool with that. And yet all the struggle of the structures and the ways that it got recast. I'm super geeky about this. May not be really interesting to you, but it's a place that isn't as close to home, where we can see some of the building of these tensions and the snap of the rubber band. The French Revolution is a particularly potent example of a rubber band that snapped really, really hard when the system was persistent, that had people starving to death while the aristocracy was living in decadence and controlling the money. It wasn't a stable situation, and it got really, really ugly and really violent and really intense as it went through the take apart. And again, coming back to the personal, you can probably find times in your life where you were pulling the rubber band that you can see in retrospect by trying to stabilize something that really didn't work for you. One of the systems that I recommend to people who are making big decisions, I like to give the counsel that, the part of you that feels like the decision is super hard to make is a part of you that doesn't trust yourself to choose again. So if you have higher self-trust, it doesn't necessarily have to feel like a decision is life or death. We have good reasons for thinking that. Our instincts will tell us that a decision is life or death, but it's bad information. I often think of the counsel of the instincts like a drunk person screaming bad advice, because they love us so much and they want us to be well. But their advice is, absolutely lousy for good reasons. They're really good biological reasons that we feel like choices, even a small choice, is really high stakes. That was another slightly awkward conversation with my guys, where they're like, you really don't have to consult us about what you have for dinner. Like, it's just not a major choice point. Could you chill? And it's okay if you're there really wanting to, tune in with your guides about, what dinner you pick. I've learned to tune in better with my body, because my body will have an opinion about how much pleasure versus nutrition would be the right sustainable balance on any given night. But when it comes to making a significant choice, especially if you have some ambivalence, it's really useful to go through the chakras one by one and see where they stand with the decision. Because if it's a hell no to any chakra, even if it's just fear motivated, even if there's just a part of you that is terrified, you want to reckon with the obstacles enough so that it's not a hell no to any part of you in order to have a sustainable path. So we can temporarily move. I think a lot of us have had that weekend where we really didn't want to have to, work really hard, but something in our life required it. There was a car repair that needed to happen or a big project at work. And what we really needed and wanted was a quiet weekend to rest. But what we were committed to and what would be better for the big picture was to, suck it up and go do the thing. So it's not to say you can't temporarily move in an unsustainable way, but gosh darn it, if you try to overfunction over time and you don't get the rest you need, there are breakdowns in health, there are breakdowns in emotional regulation, there are breakdowns in relationship. There's just a lot of pulling the rubber band that happens. And so the discernment to notice if there's any chakra that's a hell no to a particular path, even if another chakra really, really, really wants it, is a good discernment piece. But then when we do life review, it's really valuable to be able to check in and say, is there any part of me that is currently a hell no? Because when I moved into that super sweet little apartment in La Mesa with the patio where I could put my private hot tub, there wasn't a meth addict on the property. There was this super sweet gal who just really wanted me to be happy, and, it was a different equation. And then, she later got involved with some perfectly pleasant, from my point of view, men, and then ultimately ended up with this guy. And that's when things started to get rockier and rockier. And because of my resistance to change, I got really resourceful about stabilizing instead of being really resourceful about moving. And coming back to this journey that happened long before the situation fell apart and I ended up being on this, pathway of moving, very unhappily and very, very rapidly and very tiringly. This conversation happened where the guide said, look, it's free choice. You live in the world of free choice, and you can keep using your magic to stabilize your life. But if you're willing to give that up, if you're willing to recommit your magic, you're not going to have the same level of control. You will still be held. There's still a lot of alignment, but things will shift and change. And we're not going to tell you what they'll be. We're just letting you make a deep soul level choice at a fork in the path. And I didn't much like this message, but ultimately I agreed that I would like to figure out how to stop using my magic to stabilize things that had run their course and to try to avoid change that I was uncomfortable with and have my life be more dynamic for the ways that it would free up my magic and my energy to just play on a bigger scale, to do more soul retrieval, to have more impact and service to the world. Because it wasn't like I was getting something that I really wanted. It was just a controlling strategy that came out of, some of my early difficulties growing up that made me try to control everything to create safety. It's always a big warning flag if I start getting control-y pants about things that don't really matter, that I'm off my center and I should adjust it before I annoy too many of the important people in my life by trying to control them in petty ways. It's not a graceful way to relate. So in working with this, I have some suggestions for you. So first of all, I would invite you to come into relationship with the notion that we're biologically hardwired with parts of our brain to resist change. We can talk about ego death. I don't know who I would be if I made even a really positive change. Maybe you've had the experience of getting all inspired with I'm going to get into exercise, and it starts off and you feel amazing and you're getting all the benefits. But then you start to hit a point where your life will fundamentally change if you continue on this pathway. And it's very common kind of at that point, you're over the hump, you're in the new system, and then to fall out of it. And I think we just don't realize the space we need to hold for ourselves when we're making a voluntary change. There was some statistic about if people get a diagnosis that they will die if they continue with these health patterns, a very high percentage make a pivot. Not everybody, but a high percentage change their lifestyle habits. But if you go back a year later, even knowing that they'll still die, the percentage of people who are still sustaining the new life habits is a very small one. And it's not that they don't believe they're going to die. It's just how intense it is for us to make these kind of deep changes, especially if we don't realize that we're going to need to hold space for our instincts just having a pretty big freak out about a pivot in a destiny path, even if it's a really healthy, alive one, even if it's creating something, amazing for ourselves. So I think it's really useful first to be able to find this in yourself, to recognize that it's so, to have compassion for yourself, that again, we're up against some really primal biological messages that create tension in our bodies when we think about choosing again, and accounting for that when we want to make a pivot or a change, and the discernment to see where we are pulling on a rubber band, where we're using our resourcefulness and our free choice to stay with something that doesn't really serve. And I think it's really useful in this to have some kind of a system for feedback. I certainly had feedback from people who were like, Katie, are you sure you really want to keep living there? And I would explain all my completely rational sounding reasons. And they'd be like, okay, I don't love it for you, but you don't seem to be in danger. And all right. But at the same time, it's useful to know that the conscious mind can rationalize anything. A lot of what we believe to be true with our thinking mind is in service to the instincts justifying, getting the mind on board to justify moving in the way that they think we should move. So you may be familiar with the Dunning-Kruger equation. It's super useful to look up. And that's where someone who knows almost nothing about a super complicated subject thinks they're an absolute expert. And then they learn just a little bit about that, and their perceived notion of how much they know plummets to a very, very low level. And then slowly over time, with actual mastery of the subject, their perceived mastery goes up. But they never really hit, even the absolute experts in the field never really hit the level of the ignorant person who, listened to one podcast and now thinks they completely understand world economics. And we've certainly been in the conversation with someone who knows less than we do, pontificating about a subject we're an expert. I had a friend who I stopped spending time with because he mansplained law of attraction to me. And that was that kind of worked my last nerve. But in general, it's nice to have compassion for ourselves, and it's a lot easier to spot in others than ourselves. But our brains do this to all of us. And it's because it takes a ton of effort to onboard information. Like, you want to see a really tired person, put an adult in a language immersion class. They will be stare at the wall exhausted by the end of, 8 hours of trying to onboard a language, because the brain has to create all these neural pathways and work so much harder. It wants to stay in the groove of what's known. One of the cognitive biases that's documented is if a friend of you tells a shortcut for somewhere you drive and you try it out and you're like, oh no, that took way longer. And then you look at the clock and you're like, wow, that was actually significantly shorter. It's because your brain doesn't do it on autopilot. If you've driven something a whole bunch of times, the brain can go into power save mode. Whereas if you're driving a new route, you're alert, you're looking for where are the stop signs, what do I need to process? And so subjectively, it feels like it took more because you used more calories taking a shorter duration route that wasn't super familiar. And it's just really useful to know this about our brain, the ways that we can lie to ourselves. And I'm an intelligent person, so I came up with some really compelling sounding rationalizations that were about how much I am psychologically attached to having my roots in the ground and not moving houses. And not everybody's this way. When my sister lived in San Diego for a lot of years, she'd hang at a place for a year or so, and then she'd kind of be done with it. So she'd want to try something else, and she'd move to another house, and she'd be there for a while, and then she'd move to another house. It was just kind of her. I think I'm ready to choose again. I think I'd like to be closer to the beach now. Yeah, I think I'd like to have, more personal space, just these movements that always really aligned for her. And then when she came into completion, she was ready for something else. So, she didn't particularly love moving, but she was just pretty pragmatic. She kept her household really light and off she went when she was ready to choose again. So in working with this, I would invite you to ask yourself questions about places in your life that some part of you is a hell no to, that isn't working out for some part of you, that is creating tension to try to sustain it. And if it's a teeny tiny little bit of aggravation, it might not be a big deal. But if there's some part of you that's just howling, I do not want to go into this job, I don't, that's going to create some problems, because when we don't directly reckon with these things, these parts of us tend to go covert. So it makes it very easy to make a firing level mistake at the job that you hate, or end up with a health problem that gives you no option but to quit and figure it out. And these work out in the fullness of time. Most people, when pushed into resourcefulness, figure something out. I certainly figured out how to work out the income thing when I wasn't in the really cheap place with the meth addict anymore. But if we spot them sooner and we don't pull the rubber band as hard, there's a lot more grace in the pivot. If I had pivoted in my living situation, it would have put a lot less wear and tear on me. It would have cost less. It would have been less dramatic. It just would have been a heck of a lot more graceful to leave before it hit a breaking point for me. And similarly with a job, you'll have more resourcefulness to choose again, or a relationship. A lot of people take their relationships to the really, really bitter end, and then there's a lot of bad feeling left by the time they finally overcome their fear of leaving and step away. And I'm not saying willy-nilly step away from relationships or jobs or living situations or those kind of things. I'm just saying that lying to yourself that you're okay with things that are diminishing your affinity and your joy and your sustainability for something isn't a sustainable strategy. So when I'm working with a client, I'm always assessing whether we're moving their life to something more elegant and fulfilling and happy and needs met, or whether we're triaging a situation where they're on a train track that's going to run off a cliff if they don't pivot, and they're stuck in how to make the pivot, because those are completely different approaches to the session. If they're putting their life on something that's going to put them on a downward spiral versus everything's at sustainability, how do we work on an upward spiral? So when you're reckoning with this, it's really good to ask yourself this question: is there any part of me that is really having a problem with how I'm doing life that I'm not listening to? And I would love to emphasize the incredible value of qualified feedback, because we're so good at lying to ourselves. Our brains are so wired to be magnificent at lying to ourselves to justify something our instincts think will help with our survival. I've heard all the rationalizations for staying with a, abusive job or a really terrible relationship. And I have a lot of compassion for that. I have compassion for being in the rationalization of something, but it's really hard to see our own rationalizations. We can see them in retrospect. So I think there's a lot of merit to getting quality and qualified feedback. It's one of the things I love to provide. So if you're looking for someone who can do that for you in a way that acknowledges the spiritual side, because one of the limits of therapy is they don't really talk about the energetic side of things, and I like to weave that in, but it can be a really good therapist. It just needs to be, somebody who's equally smart as you are, because sometimes, overly smart people can run circles around therapists, and a therapist who's really done their inner work. But this willingness to get feedback from a qualified source, where you have people you can take counsel, where you have people who can help you gently and kindly to see your blind spots, because we're not very good at them. I mean, I'm expert level at shamanic journey, very, very good at it. And I still have somebody I see a couple times a month to point out my blind spots, because it's just easier and more elegant that way. And I don't pull rubber bands as hard. So I'm not suggesting that with good feedback, you won't pull rubber bands, but it will be a lot more graceful the less hard you pull them, the less time you commit to them, the more able you are to make a pivot when it really needs to happen and to have really good discernment about that. Because for a lot of people, there's this pendulum swing thing that happens where they pursue one strategy, like a job they hate, because the money is really good. And then that blows up. Maybe they storm out, really, really angry, or there's some other issue. And then there's a huge relief of never having to go back to that place. But then there's the point where it would be really good to start looking for another job. And I work with people who just get frozen in I know I need to look for a job and I am just not doing it. I can't make myself do it. And there's a self-trust issue that is being perpetuated anytime we're pulling a rubber band, so that the part that wasn't being listened to, when it finally gets the upper hand, fights the transition. And this can come up in a subtle way. If I find that I'm fighting coming out of productive time, it's 10 o'clock at night and I'm like, just one more thing, when I really need to be winding down for bed and resting, I'm like, okay. Or if I go into the yin and the rest and I'm resisting going back into productivity, it means that those sides aren't trusting the power share. They're not trusting that if I go into productivity, I won't exhaust myself and then, just have more caffeine and sugar to keep going. Or they're not trusting that if I take the rest I need, I'll circle back to the things that I really need to do. And I work with that. I notice that when I resist transition or balance, there's an indication that I'm off. I'm not talking to myself as well as I could, or collaborating with myself. And so the final thing I want to leave you with is that in terms of these rubber band pulling, of course, noticing and course correcting as earlier rather than later is really elegant. But one of the intentions and one of the things we can ask of our guides is, when something does break, when something does come in to take apart, that they really support us in the take apart, while it may still be uncomfortable, being really elegant. So one of the things I can look at is, I moved really fast from the one place and ended up in a not very sustainable situation. But then when I moved deliberately out of that, it wasn't dangerous. It was just, a really mentally ill person who, was very activating to my nervous system. The place that I ended up with has been super sustainable. I've been here for, coming up on, this will be the 6th year and 5.5 years. And it really authentically works for me. It is truly aligned. And that's lovely, and so even though I went through all this discomfort, the outcome was something that was really up-leveling my life. And so I really just kind of want to offer this intention and prayer that we can make to our guides, which is, help me to see where I'm pulling the rubber band, or whatever phrase. Help me to see where I'm not willing to evolve or change or reorganize something that isn't serving. Help me see where, out of fear of change, I'm anchoring something with my personal energy that isn't good. You'll be really tired if this is something you're doing a lot of. It takes a lot of energy, along with suppressing emotion. That's also one that takes a lot of energy. And then to have your guides kind of midwifing your life into whatever it's becoming in these dynamic moments with a lot of movement. I ended a major relationship, moved houses, and had my engineering job go away all within about a month's time. And I had a non-refundable trip to Hawaii that I was off. So I was like flinging my stuff into the new house, paying someone an exorbitant amount to stay with my kitty cat, and off to Hawaii. It was a very tumultuous time, but a lot of things moved and reorganized really potently. And after I handled all the basics, I was able to go into ceremony and work with the guides and move through the take apart on this really wonderful land. And I remember when I was going through all of this thinking, like, I'd probably be a lot more upset about the job, which was the third thing that hit, but I'm pretty much at capacity. Like, I just don't have the room. So I would function really well, and then I would sit down and sob my eyes out when I had a window, and then I would function some more. And wow, they talk about being in the moment, and I wouldn't recommend this, but I am really just in the present moment solving this situation, because that just is what really needs to happen. And so I don't recommend that as a approach to mindfulness, but it was just an interesting thing that I remember thinking about in one of these times where the tension built up of moves that I wasn't making, moving from a living situation that wasn't working, a relationship that was, quite miserable, and this job that I really didn't have my heart in. And the thing that got eroded by all this other tension was my ability to have the self-discipline to really show up and do a good job. So they went through a round of layoffs, and I was the top choice of a person when they were reorganizing. They were growing, but I got laid off, and that was great because I didn't get fired and I had some unemployment. I hadn't done anything reprehensible enough to justify firing, but it was definitely an intense moment. So one of the things that you can talk to your guides about is helping when the rubber band snaps to see the path forward and to help the energy reorganize in really elegant ways. It's a subtle but really useful intention. So all of that is to say, know that you're pulling the rubber band, know that you have good biological reasons for it. Try to spot it as much as you can on your own and ask that question. Get really qualified feedback, because if you're deeply invested in something, you're going to be very good at lying to yourself about it. So having someone else who can hold up a mirror as a trusted, effective source. There are a lot of people who maybe don't get the complexity of you, so they just can't give good counsel. They may love you, but they may not be able to give good counsel. And when things do move, really, really pulling in the guides for that support, because there's a lot of aliveness and magic that can move. Some people come out of the end of a really bad relationship really depleted and depressed and unhappy, and other people just light up and thrive. Their health gets better, can see the glow in their cheeks. There's the old joke about, oh, did you lose some weight? Yeah, about 170 pounds worth, of or whatever your former partner happened to weigh at the time. But that experience of aliveness that sometimes comes out of these things that we may have fought kicking and screaming. So I hope there's something that's helpful for you. I know it's a lot of rambling about a lot of different things, and this is just something that I really love to provide. So if you're someone who feels called to work with me on an ongoing basis, I really love helping people to shine a light on this kind of thing. So I want to make a quick offer for my services, and it's totally fine if that's not lined up, not in your budget. Again, I hope there's something that's valuable here, but whenever I fall in a hole, I really want to, point other people so they may still fall in a hole, but maybe they won't fall in as many holes, and maybe they'll have more situational awareness when they fall in a hole, because nobody really pointed out in a way that landed in my head about this pulling the rubber band thing until the guides sat me down and talked to me about it. And it was a delay before everything started reorganizing so dynamically after that. Not that I think it would have been sustainable permanently any which way I chose, but that's, a little piece of my journey that I hope helps you to find your way on yours. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.